In 1978, a small provision buried on page 1100 of the United States tax codes created something nobody understood the size of yet. It was called Section 401k. Nobody threw a parade, nobody wrote a headline, but over the next 4 decades, that single clause would move more than $8 trillion out of the hands of professional pension managers and into the hands of ordinary people who had never been trained to manage money in their lives. And quietly, an entire industry grew up around that $8 trillion, charging fees so small they were almost invisible, and so persistent they would eat away nearly a third of the average worker's retirement savings before that worker ever noticed. This is the story of the fee nobody reads, the fee that isn't hidden exactly, it's just never explained. Here's the part they never told you. A 1% fee doesn't sound like theft, it sounds like nothing, a rounding error. But run that 1% over 40 years of compounding, and it isn't a rounding error anymore. It's roughly a third of your entire retirement account. Gone. Not stolen in a single dramatic heist, bled out. 1% point at a time. For 4 decades, while you were told your money was simply being managed. So, who built this system, and why does almost nobody understand how much it costs them? Start with the players. On one side, you have the employer who picks the 401k plan for the whole company. Usually, this decision falls to someone in human resources, someone who is very good at their job and almost never trained as a financial analyst. On the other side of this plan sits the plan provider, a financial services company that administers the plan, chooses which mutual funds are available, and processes every contribution. And in between those two sits a quiet financial arrangement called revenue sharing, where mutual funds companies pay a slice of their fees back to the plan provider for the privilege of being included in your menu of investment options. Think about what that arrangement actually creates. The provider building your fund lineup has a direct financial incentive to include funds that pay it more, not funds that cost you less. It's not illegal, it's not even hidden technically. It's disclosed in a document called a 408B2 disclosure, a document almost no employee has ever heard of, let alone read. The employer who has a legal duty to act as a fiduciary for its employees often doesn't dig deeply enough into that document to catch the difference between a reasonable fee and an inflated one. The employee staring at a list of 20 fund names with numbers next to them almost never does either. And so the fees layered 3 or 4 deep get absorbed so gradually into account balances that most people go their entire working life without asking a single question about them. John Bogle, the founder of Vanguard and one of the most relentless critiques the fund industry ever produced, spent decades trying to make this simple point land. Cost is the one variable an investor can actually control, and it is also the variable the industry has the least interest in making visible. He didn't say this quietly. He said it in speeches, in Senate testimony, in book after book, arguing that the mathematics of compounding costs were being hidden behind confusing fund names and then fine print. Most people never saw those speeches. They saw a glossy retirement plan brochure with a picture of a beach on it. Now, walk through how scheme actually works because it isn't one single fee, it's four or five of them stacked. There's the expense ratio, the annual percentage a mutual fund charges just to exist, which can range from a whisper thin 0.03% for an index fund to well over 1.5% for an actively managed fund that historically underperforms its benchmark most of the time anyway. There's the administrative fee charged by the plan provider to keep the account running. There's a record keeping fee, and sometimes layered on top of all of it, there's a wrap fee charged by the insurance company that packaged the whole plan in the first place. None of these fees showed up as a single line item pulled from your paycheck. They're deducted directly from the fund's returns, quietly before you ever see your statement. Your balance simply grows a little slower than it should. There's no receipt, there's no invoice, there's just a number every year that's a little smaller than the math says it should be. For years, this was almost entirely legal and almost entirely unregulated in any meaningful way because the law governing these plans, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, required fiduciaries to act in the best interest of plan participants, but left enormous room for interception about what reasonable fees actually meant. Reasonable compared to what? Compared to whom? For decades, nobody in a position of power was forced to answer that question with any real precision. And the industry had no reason to volunteer an answer. Every fund company wanted shelf space on your plan's menu. Every plan provider wanted revenue sharing income. Every employer wanted to spend as little time as possible administering a benefit that, from the outside, looked like it was simply running itself. The incentives all pointed the same directions, and that direction was away from scrutiny. Then the cracks started to show. In 2007, a group of employees at Edison International, the parent company of Southern California Edison, filed a lawsuit that would eventually reach the Supreme Court. The case, Tibble versus Edison International, argued that the company had loaded its 401k plan with a retail class mutual fund shares carrying higher fees when nearly identical institutional class shares with dramatically lower fees were available for the exact same funds. The employees weren't accusing anyone of fraud in the traditional sense. They were accusing their employer of simply not paying attention, of defaulting to the expensive option because nobody in charge had bothered to check. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that plan fiduciaries have an ongoing duty to monitor investment fees, not just review them once at their start. It seemed like a small technical ruling. It shaped how companies across the country were forced to think about their retirement plans. Around the same time, journalist Helene Olin was doing something almost nobody in financial media was doing consistently, tracing exactly how this personal finance industry profited from the confusion of ordinary savers. Her reporting, along with the 2013 PBS Frontline documentary, The Retirement Gamble, produced by veteran investigative journalist Martin Smith, pulled back the curtain on just how much fees could erode a retirement account and how little most 401k participants understood about what they were actually paying. The documentary walked through the math on camera: two workers, identical salaries, identical contributions, one paying a fund fee of a quarter of 1%, the other paying 2%. Over a working lifetime, the differences wasn't a few $1,000s, it was hundreds of thousands. The lawsuits kept coming. Companies including Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and the Fidelity itself faced litigation over 401k fee structures throughout the 2010s, with several settling over for tens of millions of dollars rather than risk a jury verdict. The Department of Labor, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, spent years fighting over a proposed fiduciary rule that would have forced financial advisors managing retirement accounts to act strictly in the client's best interest, rather than simply recommend investments that were merely suitable. The rule was proposed, blocked, revised, delayed, partially implemented, and challenged in court for the better part of a decade. A case study in how much resistance even modest reform faces when trillions of dollars in fees are on the line. So, what happened to everyone once the lawsuit settles and the headlines faded? For the industry, remarkably little. Fee structures adjusted at the margins. Some companies quietly moved their plans toward lower cost institutional share classes to avoid becoming the next Tibble. Index funds, the low cost alternative Bogle had spent his career championing, saw a wave of new inflows through the 2010s as more employers began offering them as default options. Target date funds, bundled portfolios that automatically shift from stocks to bonds as retirement approaches, became the default choice at most large companies, marketed as simpler and safer. Though even these came with their own layered fee structures that varied wildly from provider to provider. But for tens of millions of workers who had already spent decades inside expensive plans, there was no retroactive fix. The compounding had already happened, the money that would have grown hadn't. Settlement checks, when they came at all, amounted to a few $100s per participant, spread across a lifetime of losses that ran into the tens of thousands. Class action attorneys collected their fees, plan providers issued settlements about their renewed commitment to transparency, and the fund menu on the next employee's laptop screen looked almost identical to the one that had triggered the lawsuit in the first place. Meanwhile, the fiduciary rule that the Department of Labor had spent a decade fighting to implement was formally vacated by a federal appeals court in 2018, leaving the underlying suitability standard largely intact for millions of retirement savers working with commissioned advisors. The rule wasn't killed by a single villain, it was worn down by years of industry lobbying, competing court challenges, and a change in administration until the momentum simply ran out. And for the average worker checking their retirement account today, the system looks almost exactly the same as it did in 2007. The fund menu, the glossy brochure, the line at the bottom that says expense ratio printed in a font size clearly not designed to be read. Here's what this reveals about the system today, and it isn't really about 401k plans specifically, it's about how modern financial harm works. Nobody has to break into your account. Nobody has to forge your signature. The money simply leaves a little more slowly than it arrives, filtered out through fees that are technically fully disclosed, buried in documents that almost nobody is ever going to sit down and read line by line. It is, in a very real sense, the perfect financial crime because it isn't a crime at all. It's a business model hiding inside a retirement plan you were told to trust. So the next time you open your 401k statement, look past the balance, look for the expense ratio, compare it to an index fund charging a fraction of 1%, because in 1978, a small provision buried on page 1100 of the tax code created something nobody understood the size of. And 40 years later, most people still don't. The only difference now is that you do. I'll be posting another video like this every week, so subscribe if you want to hear out, and have a lovely day. Take care.